see that from where you're sitting. You probably can't see it from home either. It's a book by Dr. Will Gaffney. It is called Womanist Midrash, hence the name of our series. And as I hope you remember, Dr. Gaffney will be with us as our Tippy speaker in early March, March 4th and 5th, that first Saturday and Sunday in March. Will Gaffney is a big Tippy speaker and kind of a big deal for us to have her come to Fayetteville. She is an Episcopal priest and a Hebrew scholar, and this is one of her works, but not only is her scholarship, but her voice, her preaching, her liturgical engagement are a gift to me, and I think a gift to the wider church. And so, but Dr. Gaffney has a tendency to shake things up a little bit, and of all the Tippy speakers I've ever met, she seemed like the one that we needed to do the most preparatory work. And so we've had a couple of classes where we've engaged Dr. Gaffney because when she comes, we want to be able to engage her fully. So this is the second half of a class. If you were here in, let me think, that would have been October, November, when we did 2 weeks of Womanist Midrash. If you were here back then, we'll pick right up where we left off. If you weren't, don't worry. You have not missed anything that you cannot pick up on the fly. Essentially, Midrash is a Jewish or a Hebrew form of biblical studies. But instead of digging into the text, it allows the Holy Spirit to kind of expand the text. It's an ancient, mystical, faithful practice that allows God's people as community, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to hear what the Bible might not say on the surface, but what the text clearly says between the lines, between the words, as Dr. Gaffney says. And one of the ways that Midrash is beneficial to us is it allows us to hear and understand and engage the lives and the witness of many of the characters in the Bible who are mentioned only in passing or perhaps not even mentioned by name at all, many of whom are women. And so the Womanist Midrash is a chance for us to hear the stories of some of the women of Scripture that we might have missed before. So we're going to spend this week looking at some well-known characters, but perhaps characters we haven't given a fair shake to. And next week we're going to look at some less well-known characters, and we'll hear their stories as well. But before we go any further, let's start with a prayer. And I've chosen for our prayer this week and next week a form of a song of Judith. And you can see it on your screen or you can see it at the top of the handout. And let's read this prayer out loud together. I will sing a new song to my God, for you are great and glorious, wonderful in strength, invincible. Let the whole creation serve you, for you spoke and all things came into being. You sent your breath and it formed them. No one is able to resist your voice. Mountains and seas are stirred to their depths. Rocks melt like wax at your presence. But to those who fear you, you continue to show mercy. No sacrifice, however fragrant, can please you, but whoever fears the Lord shall stand in your sight forever. Thank you. Before we go any further, may I get a volunteer? Elizabeth, do you mind running the microphone at least until Adeline shows up? If you want to hand that off, I'm going to give this to Elizabeth to run the microphone. If you're new to this class, remember that we've got people watching online, and those of us in the room might be able to hear your voice, but I promise those who are watching online will not benefit from your insights or your questions unless you use the microphone, so I'd appreciate it if you'd wait for that. Today we're going to look at two characters. I bet you've heard of both of them, Sarah, also known as Sarai, and Jezebel. We've heard of those two before, haven't we? We're going to let the Bible and we're going to let Dr. Gaffney speak a little more fully into that. But before we dig into the Bible and before we hear from Dr. Gaffney, when you hear Sarah, when you Sarai, when you hear about that biblical character, where does your mind go? What's the first word or event or story or truth or impression that comes to you? When you hear Sarah or Sarai, what do you think of? Yeah, Adam.
When she laughs.
When she laughs, thank you. Up here, Richard, and then Dave. Richard, here it comes, yep. When she laughs, thank you.
I think of her as an older woman who miraculously gives birth to a child.
Yeah, her age and her miraculous childbirth, which is also to imply her barrenness, right? I think of barren woman, old woman, able to have a child. Yeah. The laughed. When you think of the laugh, yep. Anything else come to mind when you hear Sarah or Sarai? How many of us think of Abraham? Yeah, several of us, right? You know, already you can tell how we're preconditioned, right? It's hard to hear the story of Sarah or Sarai without thinking of Abram or Abraham. And in some ways, of course, their stories intertwined. A couple who'd been married, we presume, for 50, 60, 70 years. Their lives are so intertwined. But sometimes it's hard to hear the story of Sarai without hearing the story of Abram. And Sarah, of course, had her own faith, her own identity, her own name before God. What else do you think of? Anything else you think of when you think of Sarah or Sarai? The reason I use both of those names, remember, her original name, as far as we can tell from the biblical account, was Sarai, but then God changed her name. Abram became Abraham, Sarai became Sarah, at least in the English transliterations of it. Yes, Haley.
She had to put up with a lot before her name changed and she had her baby.
She had to put up with a lot? Yeah, anything in particular come to mind as a student of that?
She was just given away as a concubine, like more than once.
Yeah, twice. Yeah, we're going to read one of those stories today. Yeah, she was given away into sexual servitude. Yeah, which probably isn't the conversation, isn't the story that came up at the dinner table all that often, right? Because that's the kind of family story that we don't talk about when we get together, but it's very much a part of this family identity. And because we are children of Abraham, spiritual descendants of Abraham, it's a part of our family story as well. Well, let's dig into the text. I've given you one passage from Sarai's life, and it is that passage, the first time she is sold into sexual slavery or given into sexual slavery. Would someone read for us, please, from the handout, which is also on the screen, Genesis 12, 10 to 20. And you'll see that I'm using the Common English Bible today. Thank you very much. If you didn't get a handout, there's some by the coffee pot, but you might need to share. Thank you.
When a famine struck the land, Abram went down towards Egypt to live as an immigrant, since the famine was so severe in the land. Just before he arrived in Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know you're a good-looking woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but you will live. So tell them you are my sister, so that they will treat me well for your sake, and I will survive because of you." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw how beautiful his wife was. When Pharaoh's princes saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's household. Things went well for Abram because of her. He acquired flocks, cattle, male donkeys, men servants, women servants, female donkeys, and camels. Then the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, "What's this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I made her my wife? Now here's your wife. Take her and go." Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning Abram, and they expelled him and his wife and everything he had.
Thank you. That's a story that needs more. We need to hear more about that. We need to hear from the survivor of that experience. We need to hear from Sarah. We get some glimpses of Sarah, the laughter, right? Which, if we dwell in Genesis 12 long enough, maybe that laughter carries a different sort of tone in our ear. Turn, if you will, to the sideways small print text. I've copied several pages from the Womanist Midrash. And would somebody be willing to read on pages 32 and 33 the part that I've drawn in brackets? Who might read that bit for us, please? It's a lot of text, but we'd love to hear it. Thank you, Adam.
No problem. I love to read. As a result of a famine in Mesopotamia, Sarai and Abram went to the prosperous Egyptian empire. The text does not tell us if Lot went with them. What the text does say is that Sarai was beautiful, and her beauty was a liability to Abram. Abram feared death more than he feared giving Sarai to another man. If she is known as his sister, a more powerful man might take her from him, but let him live. If he were known as her man, he might be killed for her.
Are we all waiting on the pot? We're all waiting on
Fresh
the pot.
pot, fresh
All right.
pot.
I'll come back.
Oh, okay. The deception is for his benefit, not hers. In Genesis 12:15, what Abram feared most happened. Sarai was seized because of her great beauty and taken to the Pharaoh. The account in Genesis 12 makes clear that the Pharaoh took Sarai as his woman. And the text is clear that they lived together as a conjugal couple long enough for Abram to receive and enjoy sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, and female servants, female donkeys, and camels, and for some sort of plague to break out in the palace. The Midrashim reveal that the rabbinic interpreters understood Sarai was available for the Pharaoh's sexual use, even when they did not want to admit it. The Midrash on Exodus teaches that the God of Sinai personally came down to deliver Sarai from the Pharaoh. God tells Moses, "By your life I will go down and save the Israelites. One woman came into Egypt, and on her account I went down, and I saved her." When was this? When Pharaoh took Sarah, as it says, the Holy One plagued Pharaoh. Abram did not object to Sarai's seizure. He relinquished her to the Pharaoh and accepted a rich settlement for his loss. Her brother husband sold her to a man he knew would use her for sex. A hip-hop womanist reading of this text would say that he pimped her out. This behavior on the part of the great patriarch has proved quite vexing to generations of interpreters. Rav Huna minimizes it in Bereshit Rabbah 3:1 and 41:1, saying it was only one night and the Pharaoh never got any closer to Sarai than her shoe. But I think there is value in honoring Sarah as a survivor of sexual violence and domestic abuse and acknowledging her partner's complicity in that abuse. This is the plain truth for which womanist truth-telling calls. In a later section of the Midrash on Genesis, Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai said that to compensate her for her troubles, the Pharaoh gave Sarai his daughter Hagar as reparations. In Genesis 12:19, the Pharaoh admits that he took Sarai for his woman because he did not know she was Abram's woman. Apparently, the Pharaoh has scruples about abducting partnered women, but not unattached women. The Pharaoh confronts Abram about the deception, but Abram does not respond. He leaves with his woman and all that the Pharaoh has given him in exchange for her. In Genesis 13:1, Sarai and Abram have left Egypt. They are very wealthy. The herd animals that Abram received in exchange for Sarai's body have made him a wealthy man. In Genesis 13:18, Sarai and Abram moved to Hebron, although the text does not name her. Sarai is absent from the narrative when Lot is carried off as a war captive and when he is rescued. Sarai is absent from the narrative when Abram gives the mysterious Melchizedek, or 1/10 of everything, including the goods he received in exchange for Sarai from the Pharaoh in Genesis 14:18 through 20. Given that wealth was accrued at her expense, perhaps she should have had a say in what happened to it. Sarai is absent from the narrative when the Holy One promises Abram descendants and makes a covenant with him in Genesis 15.
Thank you very much. Turn over to the back of that page and let me read the two paragraphs on the top of 38 to offer kind of a wrap-up on Gaffney's take on Sarai. But let me read these two paragraphs. The biblical Sarah is a complex character who exercises privilege and experiences peril. In her complexity, she can be iconic for contemporary religious readers who may not find themselves on a single side of a contrived privilege-peril binary scale. Women of color who are imperiled in the United States and the wider Western world because of race and ethnicity can also exercise privilege if they are Christian and or cisgender and or heterosexual. Women who exercise white privilege can be imperiled through Muslim identity or sexual minority status. Male privilege, even white male privilege, can be eclipsed in part by sexual orientation or broader gender nonconformity. Sarah's economic and social privilege and national origin separate her from Hagar, even though they share gender peril. Their biological privilege-peril spectrum is inverted. Hagar's fertility offers little privilege, while Sarah's barrenness poses significant peril. Sarah chooses the role of female patriarch and enforces the patriarchal hierarchy on Hagar, even when Abraham does not require her to do so. She has another option, as Renita Weems demonstrates in Just a Sister Away, solidarity and sisterhood. In this reading, Sarah serves as a cautionary tale bearing witness to the temptation to exercise whatever privilege we may have over someone else rather than stand with them in shared peril, thereby extending and transforming privilege. I wanted to read that bit because although victim and survivor in this story, we also know that her story is complicated, right? We know this. We've read the story of Hagar in this series, and so we know that Sarah is not always a one who suffers. She's also one who causes suffering. Let me just pause for a moment and let's think about Sarah. Think about her witness. Think about the story of Abram giving her to Pharaoh, pretending that his wife is his sister, in order that Pharaoh will take her as a wife and not kill Abram and do the same. How do you encounter this? Is this a story you remember? Do you remember? I mean, some of us mentioned this story. Is this a story you remember? If it is, do you hear anything new in it? And if it's not a story that you remember, how do you receive it? How do you receive that from the Holy Book today? Thoughts about Sarah? Yeah, Adam.
Haley and I started reading Genesis over Advent, and so we got through this part, and I was, not familiar with this incident, and I remember the first time I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely not how we do things today here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, But on this reading, I was focused on the plagues that struck Pharaoh because of Sarai, and it really doesn't give you her opinion on what's happening, but it must have been kind of amazing to see all these things happen on your account, but also you're enduring this terrible thing, and so you're probably just, if you're Sarai, you're probably just kind of like, yeah, cool, great, can I go home?
Yeah. Yeah, and if we start with the whole, as y'all have done, if you read the whole of Abram's story, God's already reached out to Abram and made him a promise, right? And yet, despite hearing that promise, and we celebrate Abram's willingness to accept that promise and act upon it. He gets up and goes. He leaves his home and sets out for an uncharted land. And yet, this is a story of, all right, Sarai, I know God's promised that I will have children, but it's Abram's. It seems to me a lack of faithfulness, right? Or at least faithfulness as we might expect it. And as you point out, where is God to be found in this story? Not at Abram's side, but at Sarai's side. And I wonder if there's something important for us to learn that we often skip over, in part because we're uncomfortable about the story, but also in part because we don't really give much voice to Sarai's experience. And as Gaffney points out, she's not mentioned when they journey on, even though she's presumably with them. Yeah. What else? How else do you receive this story? If you've heard it or not, how do you receive this today? Yeah, thank you.
I simply see it as an act of desperation, and that Sarai is something that back in the day was a huge commodity.
Yes? Yep, Haley?
Abram did have rights to just give her away, I think, it seems like. And also I think that he was making a calculation, well, she's barren, so this may not be a huge liability.
Yeah.
I don't know.
At least maybe that's what the text wants us to hear, which is to say her body doesn't matter if she can't have children.
Yeah, I mean, he might have just had that thinking at that time.
Yeah, and one of the Gaffney earlier in this chapter, if you get it, I mean, it's not a very expensive book. It's not a book that lends itself to a page-by-page book study, but it's a great text. But one of the things she makes clear earlier is that Sarah and Abraham are actually siblings. they share the same father in a weird sort of way, maybe half siblings, which is weird. But also, it seems clear that it's not really forbidden at this point. And so, exactly what in this Chaldean Mesopotamian culture, we're not exactly sure what was and wasn't permitted. And so maybe it was permitted. He's certainly not in the text faulted for it, except by Pharaoh, which is a little strange. But yeah, any follow up?
No, I don't have much follow-up except for that, I think that everyone thought that was normal at the time, and that's not right, but that does make you pause and think, what am I doing now? That seems normal. That is absolutely wrong.
Yeah. I wonder, why is this story told? I mean, the short answer is because it happened that way. But, why preserve this story? There are lots of dinner table conversations that Abram and Sarah had, lots of adventures that they had that don't get written down. Why bother to write this one down unless somehow the Holy Spirit or the minority voices in these families and communities knew that this story had to be told? I don't think we're supposed to read the story and think, oh, that Abram, he sure was shrewd. I don't think we're supposed to read this and think, oh, that Abram, he knew how to make it through Egypt. I think we're supposed to read this and be astounded at what happens to Sarai, because you don't have to be a contemporary spouse to know that this makes bedroom conversation really interesting for the next decade at least, right? So, anyway, I'm fascinated with why does the story get written? Dave and then Kathy.
Well, and why does it happen? Why is it told twice, right? Because it happens again with Isaac and Rachel, or
It happened. Well, yeah.
One of the other.
It's a part of their story. Yep.
Yeah, I've only ever read this from the perspective of Abram. I've probably read this 20 times. I've never thought about Sarai's involvement in it. She's really just a token to be passed around.
Yeah. Which I hear the lament in your words. Yeah, Kathy.
If you spend enough time at a correction center here, you will hear the familiar parts of this story over and over and over from women who have never been arrested, but whose boyfriends or husbands are busted for drugs, and they convince the women to take the charge because they'll have less time in prison. But it ends up, so there's so many similarities around that of women taking charges for their men and then having their lives destroyed as a result.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next section, if we can. There's so much more to say about Sarai and Abram. Let's read about Jezebel. I don't want to miss the chance to read about Jezebel. Y'all have heard of Jezebel? When you hear Jezebel, what do you think of? Just say it out loud. When you think of Jezebel, what do you think of? Just say it. Richard, say it.
Betty Davis.
Betty Davis. Fair enough. What else? What do you think of when you hear Jezebel? She's a hussy. What else do you think of? Yeah, I'm sorry. Betrayal. Yeah. Wicked, evil. Do you know any human beings named Jezebel? Have you ever met a Jezebel? It's one of those names that we don't give out very often because we use it we use it as a label. Oh, she's a Jezebel. Never he's a Jezebel, of course. Always she's a Jezebel. But and maybe not as much today as we did maybe 50 years ago. I don't know. But oh, she's a Jezebel, right? We know that label. We know what it means. Let's read the hard parts of the story, but then we're going to dig into the middle of it. Who would read for us, please, both? Let's start with the first one. Who would read the 1 Kings 16 passage? Adeline will, thank you. And Adam, would you pick up and read the second passage? Thank you.
In the 38th year of Judah's king Asa, Ahab, Omri's son, became king of Israel. He ruled over Israel and Samaria for 22 years and did evil in the Lord's eyes, more than anyone who preceded him. Ahab found it easy to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, Nebat's son. He married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, who was the king of the Sidonians. He served and worshipped Baal. He made an altar for Baal in the Baal temple he had constructed in Samaria. Ahab also made a sacred pole and did more to anger the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of Israel's kings who preceded him.
Thank you. Adam?
Jehu then went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard of it, she put on her eyeshadow and arranged her hair. She looked down out of the window. When Jehu came through the gate, she said, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, you master murderer?" Jehu looked up to the window and said, "Who's on my side? Anyone?" 2 or 3 high officials looked down on him. Then he said, "Throw her out." So they threw her out of the window. Some of her blood splattered against the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her. Jehu then went in to eat and drink. He said, "Deal with this cursed woman and bury her. She was, after all, a king's daughter." They went to bury her, but they couldn't find her body. Only her skull was left, along with her hands and feet. They went back and reported this to Jehu. He said, "This is the Lord's word spoken through his servant Elijah from Tishbe. Dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh in the area of Jezreel. Jezebel's corpse will be hung like dung spread out in a field in that plot of land in Jezreel, so no one will be able to say, 'This was Jezebel.'"
We know Jezebel, but do we remember why she's hated so much by the biblical text? Do you remember that? We get a glimpse of it at the first paragraph, and then we see, of course, her gruesome death in the second story. She was hated and is hated because she was foreign. She worshiped foreign gods, and she is presumed to lead Israel's kings astray. She married Ahab. Imagine, it's not all that long ago in Western European history, right, where a prince from one nation marries a princess from another nation so that an alliance can form. And if for some reason that tends to undermine the authority, the integrity, of the economy of the original nation, then people start to criticize the marriage, right? We start to blame that foreign spouse for unduly influencing it. It's the same story we hear in Jezebel. But what I want to highlight is what I think Dr. Gaffney helps us see. And it's pretty hard to see anything good about Jezebel. Just read the text. But I really appreciate what Gaffney says. So let me read for us. Turn to page, it's labeled 242. I'm only going to read a little bit of 242. And then I'm going to get somebody else to read what's on the next page. But there on page 242, I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs just to hear a little bit about Jezebel from a different perspective. Do y'all see where I am on 242? 1 Kings 16:31 criticizes Ahab's selection of Jezebel as his bride because she is foreign and because she and her people worship Baal along with Asherah. Jezebel is not the only foreign woman married to an Israelite or Judean monarch to maintain fidelity to her religion and culture of origin, yet clearly she is among the most, if not the most, despised. It is probable that Jezebel's religious devotion is embarrassing for the biblical editors. Her faith was a non-negotiable, in spite of living in a foreign land and being married to someone with a different, intolerant religion. On the other hand, the Israelites seem to have never met another deity that they wouldn't try out for a while. Their love affair with Baal in particular, that junior deity with a bad habit of trying to kill off the father god El, with whom Yahweh has self-identified, was a serious problem. Jezebel is a model of religious fidelity. She is faithful to her gods until the moment of her death. Jezebel appears next in 1 Kings 18:4, killing off the prophets who do not serve her gods. Her decision to persecute and execute the indigenous prophets in the land to which she has come as a foreign bride is extraordinary. In addition to keeping faith with her gods, she is eradicating a significant component of the local religion. Though described as a colonized woman, a Chagall, Jezebel is colonizing the religious landscape around her. She is something of a fundamentalist. Her support of her own prophets on an industrial scale can be read as evangelical missionary work. Jezebel uses the considerable resources at her disposal to support the religious institutions of her people in her new land. She feeds 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah out of the royal treasury, figuratively her table. Just read the next sentence, and then we'll stop. Jezebel is the power of the throne. She is not the power behind the throne. What's so interesting about Jezebel, and we never get a chance to hear this, but she's faithful. She's wildly faithful, just to the wrong God. She's faithful to the God of her childhood, the God of her parents, the God of her ancestry. She's faithful to the God that she knew her father is Eth Baal. As if to say, in the same way that the divine name, Israel's divine name, gets added to names like Samuel. Then we also hear Baal, her father, is devoted to the Baal, and so naturally she is. And we, the biblical text, and we are inheritors of the biblical text, cannot handle her faithfulness. Granted, it's Israel's story, and maybe we would say there's no room for Baal worship or Asherah worship in Israel, but as Gaffney points out, there are plenty of other Israelite examples of people who worship foreign gods, and for some reason Jezebel becomes the icon of faithlessness, despite being in some ways the paragon of faithfulness. How do you receive that? How do you dig through that? Is that strange? Or am I asking something of you that you're uncomfortable to give, which is okay, and you don't have to give it to see the text that way? What do you hear in that? How do you hear in that something today? Have you ever, yeah, Richard. And as when the microphone comes to Richard, think, have you ever met someone whose faithfulness you found threatening? We'll come back to that in a minute, but go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of distracted by the second question.
Yeah, that's okay.
Because yes, I have. But let's see. And what was the first question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, what do you take from Jezebel? What do you hear from Jezebel's story? How does that leave you?
Yeah. She confronts Israel and their worship of Yahweh with the same sort of rigidness and inflexibility that they have in their worship of their God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so she's actually like a mirror back to them, saying, this is what you're really like.
Yeah.
And it's a threat, but it's also a challenge.
Yeah, thank you. Other reflections on that, or the second thing I've asked, which is, have you ever met someone whose faithfulness you found threatening? Yeah.
To piggyback off of Richard, it's who is just like you is the one that you hate the most.
Oh, isn't that true? Yeah, isn't that true? Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And close enough to us that we can't leave any room in the telling of her story for something positive, right? She, of course, the one who is zealous for the wrong God becomes the one we denounce zealously, right? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There can be no room for her faithfulness, which is, I think, part of why her death is so gruesome. Yeah. Other reflections? Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate that you keep asking the question, have you ever been intimidated by someone's faith? And I think that for most people, that's a hard thing to talk about or admit in a room full of people.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people have come face to face with that, and I think we've all seen it too when people are talking, having a discussion about their faith, and then one person gets really quiet and seems really closed off. Because I know I've experienced that personally myself. But it's a hard thing I think for most people to admit, So I felt like that's an interesting feeling for me without trying to project on other people.
Thank you for that. You help me hear. Some of us have experienced religious trauma from individuals who I presume are uncomfortable with our faithfulness, our form of faithfulness, right? Especially when we've belonged to families or congregations or traditions that don't allow disagreement or question or diversity. And then we end up, it's actually what is perceived as faithlessness, but is actually, we're just trying to be faithful. We're just trying to be faithful to who we are and to the God who knows us and loves us. But it doesn't always sound like what other people do. And then sometimes they respond to us in the same way that Jezebel's treated. But they use the same God, they use the same names for God and the same Bible, and yet still just as fully denouncing. Yeah, thank you for helping me hear that. Thank you. Yeah, Adam.
Yeah, there are a lot of political figures, even just across the street, who express their faithfulness and their zealousness in ways that do intimidate me and a lot of other people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Would somebody read for us, please, before we finish, on the very back page, the bit about Jezebel's death narrative? And let me think about it. I don't think we have time to read the whole thing, but would someone, let's just read the first two paragraphs, the full paragraph on the page 245, and then the paragraph that starts on 245 and finishes at 246. Adeline, would you mind reading that for us? Thank you.
Jezebel's death narrative is without peer in Scripture. It is an epic event told in 4 acts that take up 30 verses. In the first act, God pronounces sentence on Ahab and Jezebel to Elijah. In the second act, Ahab's death and aftermath fulfill God's prediction, foreshadowing Jezebel's looming fate. In the third act, an anonymous young prophet reissues the judgment on Jezebel and the remaining house of Ahab. The fourth act is a narration of Jezebel's death in 2 Kings 9:30 through 37. The accounts exemplify a prophecy and fulfillment rubric. Jezebel is an object lesson, along with Ahab to a lesser degree. Jezebel's violent death and the disposition of her corpse, a horrendous desecration by a profane animal, are a warning. Her fate is a warning to women who would usurp power and to men who marry foreign women. To make its point, the overarching narrative emphasizes that the violently spilled blood of Ahab will not be covered by the earth, but instead be licked up by dogs. Prediction in 1 Kings 21:19. Fulfillment in 1 Kings 22:36. The Septuagint also predicts prostitutes will bathe in this blood in 1 Kings 20:19. Fulfilled in 1 Kings 22:38, but without antecedent in
the MT.
Prediction and fulfillment accounts repeat that the flesh of Jezebel will be and is eaten by dogs. Lastly, the account of Jezebel's death includes the infamous scene in which she prepares for her death by putting on her makeup and doing her hair.
One more paragraph for me. Thank you.
Why does Jezebel adorn herself for her death? It is the ultimate use of feminine wiles to seduce her killer into changing his mind. No, the emphasis on Jezebel's appearance, even womanliness, is not about sex. Her executioners are eunuchs, men on whom seduction skills would be of no avail. Instead, it is about her sense of self. Jezebel is a woman and a foreigner, doubly marginalized and doubly despised. As a woman, culturally constructed through the artifice of beauty, she will go to her death. She is a queen until the end, determined to go to her death on her own terms.
Thank you. We don't have time to read the rest, but take the sheet away with you and read it. I highly recommend that you consider purchasing the text. It's rich in this way. So, and this is a personal question, and so perhaps the response is asking too much. Just if you want to respond, of course, but maybe perhaps hold on to it. Like, when in our world, in our lifetime, do we see strong women whose example of faithfulness is a threat to men and to institutions, organizations of religion that have been run by men? When do we see them labeled the way we label Jezebel, right? It is not an accident. It is not an accident that Jezebel, who is powerful and faithful, becomes a label that we still use to describe those sorts of women. And it's always women. Even if Jezebel is not faithful to Israel's God, surely it's important for us to redeem at least some of her witness before we continue to literally bury women for their daring to come up against people who've been in positions of power, people like me for so long. Yes?
Well, this is not about marriage because she's celibate, but the first thing that comes to mind to me is Mother Teresa.
Yes?
She's Catholic, and it's within a system that's all about the power structure and the hierarchy of males. So she's exceptional with that she has such a effect on so many people without having to be under that restriction.
Yes? Yes? Thank you. Richard, and then Adeline? And then we'll finish.
Another example of a woman who is a threat, but somehow not a threat, I think is Phyllis Schlafly. She was drew a lot of power, she felt, from the male patriarchy. So she spent a lot of time supporting that and getting other women to support it. And, now we have a problem with some young Christian men saying that women should prostitute themselves to them. And I've heard them on, talk radio and stuff saying this. And part of that comes from Phyllis Schlafly, because basically that's what she's talking about. She's prostituting herself to her husband to gain power, which is a perversion of what I think the Bible tells us what the relationship between men and women in marriage should be.
Thank you. I don't know anything about that person or that story, but I appreciate you sharing. Adeline?
The thing that comes to mind for me as a descendant of European people is the way in which our Christianity came and colonized the Americas. As we were foreigners coming into a land and killing people who were praising other gods. So in many ways, like as Christians, we fit into this Jezebel narrative. But conversely are also descendants of people who brutally killed the people who were really faithful, native people who were really faithful to their own religion. So we're sort of in both roles there. But I think it is interesting to have a Christian perspective that is deeply colonial and critical of Jezebel. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, thank you. If we don't take time to listen to voices who hear the story of Jezebel differently from the ones we've always heard tell the story of Jezebel, then all Jezebel is a label, right? There's nothing more than the label, and yet there's so much more within her story. I can't quite fall in love with Jezebel because she does some really terrible stuff, and yet I need to at least hear her story and hear her struggle and recognize that there's a humanity there. I think Gaffney does a great job in parts that we didn't get a chance to read to help us hear her needs, her own struggles, her marriage, her love, her compassion. She's a complex character. Sarah is a complex character. Hagar is a complex character. These are all real human beings who feel the way that we feel and experience things as we experience them. And yet so often the story, only told through a majority voice, misses it. So I'm grateful for Dr. Gaffney. I'm grateful for the text. I'm grateful for the chance to revisit this. Next week, we will look at two more stories of less prominent women, but stories that are important for our own formation and edification. And I hope you'll be back next Sunday. Thank you all so much.